I'm going to tell you a story today, and hopefully at the end of the story, you'll realize that by just forwarding on all of those terribly exciting things that you get on WhatsApp, you're contributing to the problem, and that you are actually making yourself into a useful idiot. It's an industry that I've been in now for 42 years. I started my career as a trainee financial journalist at the Citizen in 1980, then worked the Rand Daily Mail, Sunday Times, etc. So it's my belief, having listened to more speeches and talks than I could count, that the best is when people talk about the stuff they know, not what they think. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I know, which is the industry that I'm in. And BizNews, by the way, turns 10 years old on the 4th of August, which is quite extraordinary. Of the generation I'm at, who started with typewriters and carbon copies, to see where we are today is extraordinary. I'll also tell you a little bit about artificial intelligence. Those of you who were here when I came back from Davos, I hope you're all very happy having bought the shares that I recommended there, Palantir and NVIDIA, which have both gone up 70, 80%. So those of you who didn't, I'm not going to repeat it today, because when you hit a home run, you don't swing at every single shot. But it's been incredible, the artificial intelligence boom that we've had. So let's start the story by describing to you what a racket is, because this is going to assist in understanding better what comes. A racket is something, and I love this definition, that is not what it seems to the majority of people, and only a small group of insiders know what's really going on, and they operate for the benefit of the few at the expense of basically everyone else. And media is a racket, but it's like a serious racket nowadays. Lots of you would have had experience with the media and would know that in many times the media seems to have gotten it wrong. Today it is deliberately gotten wrong. And that's really the thrust of what this talks about, the Yellow Press Mark II. The media started in 1455 with a guy called Johann Gutenberg, who created movable type. And what they used to do from 1455 up until 1890 is they would create a letter, write it in backwards, put a word together, put a word on a through metal type, as it were, and then print the page. Up until 1455, before Gutenberg invented movable type, there was 30,000 books in the whole of Europe, 30,000 books. 50 years later, there were 12 million. So if you can imagine the explosion of knowledge and how much we learn from books, there were 30,000 books. Clearly not a hell of a lot of people had access to knowledge. 50 years later, we had the Renaissance, etc., which showed the explosion there. But our story for today begins about 200 years ago with a fellow called Benjamin Day. And up until that point, 1830s, what happened in media was that you would sit there and you do movable type and you produce these newspapers, and then you take the newspapers and you tell it through a news agent. Now, the problem was, if you send things to a news agent, and I've been there, done that, you have what is called a sale or return. So you put your newspapers in there. If you don't sell anything, it's your problem. So it's a very hard business. And this guy, Benjamin Day, invented the sales of newspapers on the street. Within a couple of years, he did it in New York. He had a tabloid, 4 pages, called the New York Sun. And within a couple of years, there were 30 of these tabloids, because all of a sudden you had a cash business. You didn't have a business that you gave a whole bunch of newspapers that you paid, and it was painstaking to produce them. And so that exploded in the early 1800s. And that is where yellow press started. Because when you've got so many competitors, what do? You have to start getting people to buy your product rather than the next one. And you then start inventing the things that are going to bring them in. So the New York Sun was very famous for telling people in New York that there was life on the moon. And they had a whole series about how there was life on the moon. And people would buy these penny tabloids to learn about life on the moon. But it all died out because you can only fool some of the people some of the time, sometimes for quite a long time. But eventually, it got back to a stage where people stopped believing these crazy stories. But then in 1890, something happened, which brought the resuscitation of yellow press, of how you can invent stories, because that's what we're really talking about here. Fake news is the invention of bullshit. It's the invention of stuff that you start believing is the truth. And then in 1890, they had another German invented what is called linotype. And what linotype was that instead of having to put each letter in there, you could actually type it out, a whole line. And that revolutionized the media industry. Because instead of being a laborious, painful project in putting a newspaper together, suddenly dozens and dozens and dozens of newspapers were around. So what happened? Same again. If you ever want to watch a movie on what happened with the yellow press in the early 1900s, there's a wonderful movie with Orson Welles called Citizen Kane. It's a history lesson in my industry. We had the same thing, an explosion of the number of products and an explosion in fake news. I only say this because it shows you what happened in the mid-1990s when the internet came along. Because once more, there were many, many more people who can produce the content or the stuff that we read. Anybody can actually put a website together. And as a consequence of that, the stuff that we read, because of all this competition, there's a lot of nonsense that we are now fed as truth. Just from our own perspective, in the mid-80s, I worked for the Sunday Times. And even then, at the Sunday Times in South Africa, we were selling over 500,000 copies. I checked it last night. And then we used to believe in a thing called holy shit journalism. The idea was when you opened the newspaper on a Sunday morning, you had to say, holy shit. And holy shit journalism was at least true, kind of. The headlines were quite descriptive, but the stories were not always related to the headlines. I'm sure you know the story, if you know about that. Sunday Times then, in the mid-80s, sold, as I said, over 500,000. Today it sells 81,000 copies. 520,000 to 81,000 copies. My own story was in the mid-1990s, having gone through the difficulties of starting a publishing company and seeing how hard it was to break in. When this thing called the internet came along, I thought, hang on, here's something very interesting. You don't have printing or distribution costs. It's got to be the future of my industry. So I gave it all that and I started writing a blog. Now today we know about a blog. It was started a thing called a weblog. Anybody can do a blog. Anybody can create a weblog. But those blogs have completely taken over now from newspapers, as is the Sunday Times numbers, 500,000 to 80,000 today. Newspapers were very good because what they produced, you could see tomorrow or the next day whether or not they've been telling you the truth. Blogs, not like that. There's a wonderful book by a guy called Ryan Holiday called Trust Me, I'm Lying. Now, Ryan Holiday's moved on. He's now written about Stoics, etc. But he was a media manipulator and he was an insider. And the way he explains fake news, or the way that fake news was created, he would get companies paying him money, and it happens today more than ever. And those who paid the money set the narrative. In 2014, 2015, around there, especially 2015, when the Guptas and Jacob Zuma were on top of their game, they were using an organization called Bell Pottinger to do exactly what Ryan Holiday writes about. And our own experience was very sharp about that, including the creation of a Twitter profile of mine, but instead of ALEC HOGG, which is my Twitter handle, they had ALLECHOGG. Now, you look at it closely, you can't see the difference, in that, and they just took my page and replicated it. And they got some poor doctor in Durban who thought she was talking to me to incriminate herself quite badly. Took a screenshot of that. This is what the Guptas in there and Bell Pottinger did. Took a screenshot of that and then distributed that on social media, particularly on Black Twitter, as they call it, because it was a racist comment. And within 3 hours, it had spread like wildfire. You see what this racist is doing. And I'm sure there are many people who saw that direct message or a screenshot and still believe it. But it was completely fabricated. In Davos this year, we had the chief executive of Pfizer making a speech. And he spoke, and I was there, and I listened, and I thought, okay, he's not my favorite guy, but whatever. It wasn't long afterwards, some clever guy had taken that speech, cut out important words, and made it sound like he said, well, we'll kill 500,000 people because they had a agenda. Same thing with the World Economic Forum, where I've been going now for 18 years. It's an extraordinary, extraordinary place where I learn so much every time I go there. But the problem with the World Economic Forum is it teaches people new things and it democratizes knowledge and information. And the status quo don't like that. They don't want you to learn more. They want you to be ignorant, because the more ignorant you are, the more money I can make through the status quo, the less I have to work at it. And so as a consequence, the World Economic Forum gets this similar kind of treatment as we saw with the CEO of Pfizer. Klaus Schwab, who's in his 70s, and I would describe him as a super networker, but and a very clever guy as a professor. But, Klaus you would probably know everybody in the room if you were members of the World Economic Forum, but you certainly aren't going to listen to what he tells you to do. But the enemies of the World Economic Forum are saying that he is controlling the world. There's this whole world order that's being controlled. Now, if I hadn't been here before, I suppose I would have watched those videos that had been doctored and believed them. But I've been to this damn thing every year for the last 18 years, and I've got a pretty good insight into what really happens there. But that's the world we live in. The world we live in is a world of agendas, a world of much media. Anybody has access to media, and those who have lots of money hire people like Bell Pottinger. Bell Pottinger really didn't like BizNews, really didn't like us. They hired a legal firm in London called Schindler's. I hope nobody here is from Schindler's, but Schindler's is a very famous legal firm for taking on those who attack the status quo. They paid them £100,000, and it's in the Gupta leaks, to kill BizNews. That's what happens. So there is a lot going on here. The problem that we get to is when this juicy, salacious, interesting stuff comes into our inboxes, what do? Click a button and we forward to our closest people that we know. The fact it comes from you is your whole credibility is attached to whatever it is that you're sending on. And that is the way that those who have the agendas, that is like their first prize, to get to apply the useful idiots. Now, why are we useful idiots? Because for many years we've been told you can believe what you read in the media. You can believe what you watch in the media. In the early 1990s, I worked for the SABC. And back then, again, I looked it up last night, 40 million people used to watch SABC television channels. Today, 25 million people. But the population was up by more than 50%. So what it means is even in that market, even in the market of the people who absorb whatever is thrown at them, even there, the penetration of mass media, or that kind of mass media, has declined significantly. Why? Because when you get lied to enough, and it's not that the journalists are the liars, it's the people using the journalists who are the liars. Think of this for a minute. As a person who runs a media publication, you hire somebody in from university, and then you give them a platform to tell the world what they think. And then those who read it believe what they're being told. You see the story. You see how it all comes together. Barriers to entry have collapsed, and the way I try and describe it to people is if you imagine a toll road, and in the past you had one toll road between Johannesburg and Durban, and suddenly there are 1,000 toll roads. So not only are you not paying anymore, but you can actually choose any toll road you want. And that's what's happened to information. Information used to be through some pretty hectic toll roads. Now anybody can produce whatever information they want. And those who have lots of money, they can deliver that information more aggressively than others. I'll point you to the whole COVID-19 pandemic, where on BizNews Premium, we have WhatsApp groups. And we have a WhatsApp group which is interactive. There are about 350 people who are quite active on it. We had to ban the COVID-19 part of that WhatsApp group because people feel so strongly about it. So there are those who believe absolutely that this vaccine isn't going to make you sick. And there are others who say, but hang on, it has made you sick. And there are others who believe that why hasn't we been addressing COVID-19 through other type of supplements, etc. So you've got these two sides, and they are vociferous in their knowledge of what they know and what the other guys know. So eventually we had to stop the subject, start a new group for them and send them all there because they were making so much trouble. And recently we had a repeat with the Ukraine war. So in the Ukraine war, we've now got, now remember this for a minute, there is no free press in Russia. There is no free press, like in China. We had a colleague of ours, Jackie Cameron, who, with her husband, went to go and live in China. He was given a position at the Chinese university teaching journalism. She was our colleague, so we wanted Jackie to keep working for us. She couldn't. She wasn't allowed to while they lived in Beijing. She needed to be registered with the Chinese authority. So I looked into it because there is a South African company, Naspers, that's got a very big Chinese presence. And in every newsroom in China, first of all, you have to be registered. And secondly, you have a censor in the newsroom. Believe this. So whatever you write for consumption by people like us has to first be approved by the Chinese government censor. And you sit here thinking, China's not such a bad place. Imagine that in South Africa. But imagine if all the information that came to us was filtered and censored. In Russia, you have a very similar situation. If you're in the media, your chances are, if you say too much, then you disappear. I mean, it is the reality. It's not just political leaders, opposition leaders who go. But now we have a situation where Russia invades Ukraine, and there are people who believe what the Russian state is telling them through the media channels, and they believe these paid-for trolls, and they believe that a guy who's been running the country for 23 years is actually a Democrat, and that he is going to improve the country next door. So once again, we had those people fighting with the other guys who felt that Ukraine were in the right, and it got so vociferous because they know. When we read something, we know. So I know, and I'll go and argue anybody from the other side. So once again, we had to take that Ukraine war and isolate it. So go and have your little fight somewhere else. And these are intelligent people. These are people who read BizNews because they come to BizNews because they want the independent thought. They want a different view of things. So if that can happen, you can imagine what chances have the rest of us got. So is there a solution? Well, the yellow press started dying when a guy called Alec Hogg took over at the New York Times. And he took a view at the New York Times that instead of selling our newspaper for 1 penny, we would sell it for more. We would get subscribers and we would provide them news, as he described it, all the news that's fit to print. So it wouldn't be news of 2-headed babies and I was impregnated by an alien. and other kinds of interesting stories tantalize and titillate us, he started doing something very different. And the New York Times today, as you're probably well aware, is the biggest newspaper in print. There are other newspapers online which are bigger, but those newspapers are not the ones that you could believe. Of course, today a lot of people don't believe the New York Times. They say that they've gone woke and they're left and whatever. But everybody's entitled to believe Donald Trump if they want to. And those are the realities of the world that we live in. But what happened there was that it showed can fool all of the people only for a short period of time, because eventually things turn around. Eventually things change. What we're doing, having looked at all this sweep of history and the little journey that I've taken you on today, is we believe that's going to repeat itself again. We've had the newspapers come under threat from a wave of people on the internet. And right now, all of this is under threat again by a new wave called artificial intelligence, which makes anybody a publisher. Pretty easy. Try it. ChatGPT. Next time you go and play there, or Bard. Write in there, write me a fake news story about South Africa. Try it. Write me a headline that will attract people to the story that I've written here, which is complete nonsense, for instance. So there's another wave that's coming through. So what do we do about all of this? Well, first of all, don't forward stuff unless you really know where the source is. There's a media historian called W.J. Campbell. The markers, as he put it, of yellow journalism, and it's coming again, came through the internet. It's kind of dying down, but it's coming again with people using AI. He says prominent headlines, screaming excitement about ultimately unimportant news. Pala pala. I mean, what a lot of nonsense is pala pala. Please go and watch the interview I did with Paul O'Sullivan, who will explain exactly what went on there. It was a setup, clear as daylight. If you go in with an open mind and you go and see what pala pala is about, you'll see it's a setup. But of course, it's juicy if you're a politician, because you can now say Cyril's a crook. What is Cyril with a couple of $100,000 in a couch for, for heaven's sake? Just crazy. Lavish use of pictures, often with little relevance. Imposters, frauds, and fake interviews. Ostentatious support for underdog causes, what we now call woke. The use of anonymous sources, that's a biggie. When you see someone quoting an insider or someone who knows, when you hear anonymous sources. And finally, another thing of yellow journalism, and you see it all over the place, is prominent coverage of high society and events. There is a way out, there is a future, but we all have to take responsibility for it. We take responsibility for our own minds in the way that we approach life. And when it comes to my industry, I would urge you, please, to think of the background, to think of those toll roads which have now been exploded, to think of the vested interests who would prey upon those who are ignorant. That is how a lot of people make a lot of money. And in a democracy, we only have two bulwarks. The one is the court of law, and the second is the court of public opinion. And if the court of law or the court of public opinion are contaminated by the vested interests, you lose your democracy. And as we're seeing in real life events around the world, that's probably the most precious thing that any of us in this current day and age have. Thank you very much.